So good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear us both here and online. Welcome to our second day of the conference, and it is my great pleasure to announce our third keynote lecturer, Professor E. William Monter, Professor Emeritus, who has been researching various subjects from European history for many decades.
More years than we may want to remember, yes.
He's been very active even since he has retired and gained emeritus status. He has written many interesting books on subjects from European history, such as Calvin's Geneva and European witch trials, but also a very interesting book, The Rise of Female Kings, and that is, of course, related to the lecture he will be giving today, How Woman Became Fit to Rule. Professor Monter, the floor is yours, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for an only exaggerated introduction, but it is, as I said, I'm intending to follow the script that was handed out to you. It is an attempt to revisit a book that is now 10 years old, to, in the first place, figure out what has been added that is worth knowing about the processes, or if there, insofar as there are processes that were at stake here, and a chance to also say why it has been received the way it has for the last 10 years. Anyway, I'm trying to revisit it and to see if I can produce a kind of updated, condensed, I hope, version of what amounts to a central argument inside the book, but wasn't stated very well in that original book. So what I'm trying to do then is to boil it down to an hour plus talk. The official acceptance of women's fitness to rule European kingdoms, it says, occurs in the primary framework I'm suggesting is that there are two overlapping phases that coexist with each other for much of the time between 1328 and approximately 1800. These two dates around, if we split the middle chronologically, in the mid-16th century, you find that the examples, I chose my examples trying to hold on to two criteria, the examples of women who are officially acknowledged as rulers of sovereign states above the rank of duchy, preferably kingdoms, sometimes empires. In order to identify these people, I exercise two criteria. One of them is the known survival of at least one official document issued in the capacity as the monarch of the kingdom, and the other is the existence of coins struck during the time of their official rule in their names, as emphasizing on the outside of the coin the name of the woman and the name of the kingdom, and separated by the initials DGR, which is Dei Gratia Regina Rex. Okay, so until the mid-16th century, then they split the group. I came up with 30 candidates, and they divide neatly into two, almost suspiciously neatly, perhaps, into two parts. 80% of the earliest 15 involve something called joint rule, in which the woman is acknowledged as a full and equal partner, and she has a male counterpart who is a full and equal partner. The problem is that also in most cases of these joint rules, it is the husband who usually, but not always, dominates everyday government. And when you then separate the first half from the second half looks very different because there are only 3 cases of direct joint rule, and the other 12 are all women who rule autonomously, whereas the first group has very few women who rule autonomously. Only one, really, who actually, though, to compensate for being the only one, has 3 kingdoms. So that's also a record that's not matched by any of the others. So it's an interesting combination. The later group after 15, the second half, includes many who are married, but they don't run their wife's government, especially after 1700 AD. So the problem is I think the most important problem that I want to try to outline is, and to suggest maybe more clearly than I tried to do in the book originally, because I've had more time to think about it, how the process from joint rule to autonomous female rule took place. What, if anything, can we say about the apparent criteria involved that move you from the joint rule to the autonomous individual rule, which is, after all, the ordinary system for male king? So in sense, then, the earlier part, the joint rule, is the really interesting, archaic form. And I didn't have in my outline the explanation or any preconditions for it. But the centrality of joint rule is marriage. The woman is invariably married to a man who, under Western Christian law, Roman Christian law, cannot be closely related to her. And so the sacrament of marriage and the existence of joint rule follows a very fuzzy process, in my own head anyway, about how marriage in the Latin Church became a sacrament. It is the 7th sacrament. It's the last one. When I ask my colleagues, they usually say, well, it's probably the Lateran Council of 1215, something like that is the most crucial date. But I have to wait over a century before I find a joint rule, a single coronation ceremony involving 2 people, 1 woman, 1 man, who are legally married to each other. So that's the process by which a joint coronation, which was, after all, a legal innovation. And again, I repeat, I'm a non-legal trained person, so it's how this got underway and why it happened when and where it did is pretty mysterious. But the existence of coronations, of course, goes much farther, much better established. But they always had only 1 person honored by a coronation, and that was, until 1328 in the Latin West, invariably a man. And the ceremonies, I don't really want to go into too much, except to point out that the most important coronations in the early Western Roman tradition occurred in Christmas of the year AD 800, when Charlemagne is crowned by the Latin Pope as Holy Roman Emperor. And the excuse alleged by the Roman Pope is that the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, was at that moment vacant. It was not vacant. It was actually being occupied by a Greek woman named Irene, who had received proper coronation honors and certainly rules for at least 5 years in Constantinople. But anyway, the idea of women's unfitness to rule, if you will, is certainly deeply engraved, it seems to me, in the experience of Charlemagne in 800 AD. So when a woman receives a joint coronation in later medieval Europe, the husband a man is still present, more or less reassuringly, and that once it gets started, the idea of a dual coronation, husband and wife, persists for quite it reappears, I guess it's fair to say, at unpredictable intervals, unpredictable places. It's impossible to track any precedents within this system. The joint coronations exist across a span of 360 years, which is a pretty, is 1328 to 1689. So anyway, the way our records begin on the joint coronation, the first one is held in a small city of northern Spain, Pamplona, the capital of possibly even at that time the smallest kingdom in Western Europe, and in midwinter. And it also was a consequence of the earliest, what I call a velvet divorce in Latin Europe, because the new coronation in Pamplona, the capital of Navarre, separated this tiny kingdom from its gigantic neighbor to the north, the Kingdom of France. And the circumstances they're rather intricate. It involves some of the steps in the formation of the famous, or for this purpose, infamous Salic law of medieval France, which ended up as the strictest and most comprehensive legal prohibition against even indirect succession in that hereditary monarchy. And the explanation is rather intricate, because the situation in 1328 in France was that a male line had died out, and the claimant with the best apparent dynastic claim was the current King of England, Edward III, whose wife was the daughter of one of the greater French kings. What happens, there are at least two political consequences. The one we're interested in here is the fact that Navarre decides they don't want the candidate chosen by the French, and they are perfectly willing to reach in and invite the daughter of a previous very important French king, who has been passed over twice in favor of uncles. And she's only 16 years old. The first uncle took the throne when she was 4 years old. So she's been around, and by the time she's 16, she's married to a distant cousin of hers, who has no claim to the French throne. So what happens is that the French go ahead with female exclusion. The English king decides to declare the 100 Years' War. He didn't know it was a 100 Years' War, but it turns out to last 100 years, and it's very famous or infamous in late medieval history. And Navarre, the little kingdom to the south, holds a joint coronation. After negotiations with the heiress's husband, of course, those are pretty elaborate. And included the stipulation I found most interesting was that the husband, who is being jointly crowned with his wife, must acknowledge in his coronation oath that the legal guardianship of any children, should he outlive his wife and remarry, he loses legal guardianship of his wife's children, which are also his children. So this is one of the ways in which the the political nation, the legal and political notables of Navarre negotiated with the new arrangement, this novel arrangement, to the best of my knowledge, that they were trying to propose. In the end, the heiress outlives her husband. They do have a son who inherits. So, the strategy behind any marriage, in this case, it becomes a royal marriage through coronations. So this is the way it begins. But the next example follows very shortly after. Again, I'm not a medievalist, by the way, so this is all, this is great fun to discover. Joanna the First of Naples begins only 3 years later, when she is named as the heir by a king of Naples, which includes actually a lot of possessions in southern France, Robert the Wise. And he had a son who had predeceased him, but he had 2 female grandchildren, and he decided 4 years after the French began really nailing down the Salic law that he was going to name his 4-year-old granddaughter as his heir, and makes his subjects swear an oath that they will acknowledge her after his death. He lives a while longer, fiddles around with his will, and subsequently adds that she cannot rule alone. She figures that he'll probably get married because royal heiresses are quickly snapped up on the market, and that she cannot rule alone until she was at least 21. Another thing that I do not find too much in this conference is the problem of legal minimum ages for rulership. I think that a lot of polities and a lot of situations have been sufficiently flexible here to know that some teenagers are much more fit than others for this kind of responsibility and have been able to adapt their rules accordingly. Anyway, in this case, the first girl who's really named as an heir at age 4 winds up being told she can't rule alone until she's 21. And there's a third outside power who's going to moderate some of this, which is none other than the Roman papacy, because the Kingdom of Naples is a legal fief of the papacy in the 14th century. So here's what happens. She Giovanna, the heiress in question, has a much more interesting role than the little case in Navarre, in Pamplona, that began this thing. She's raised at court with a cousin within the legal limits of marriage, a prince from Hungary, and slightly younger than herself. And so in the end, what happens is not what her grandfather had ordered, but variations on it. She actually has the first coronation in 1344. As I said, her husband is underage, but they plan to have a joint coronation. Papacy having approved the first one in Navarre, they were certainly going to approve this one in 1345. Except it doesn't happen. And for the very bloodthirsty reason that her intended husband, the Hungarian prince whom she's grown up with, about a year younger than she herself, is murdered a week before the coronation. This is, of course, something that should be the subject of a great Italian opera, but to the best of my knowledge, it never has been. Anyway, this leaves, she's already crowned, so she is actually technically ruling alone, except she's too young. So by the time she gets to be old enough to, under her grandfather's will, to be allowed to rule on her own, she's actually she herself has arranged her own remarriage to a second cousin who is barely within the legal tolerable bounds. and who doesn't have permission from the Pope. But she goes. They do have. They have a second coronation. She had the first one, but it has to be redone after she is married. There is then a joint coronation of Giovanna, the heiress, and the second husband in Naples itself in 1352. So they're of age. They actually have a few children. Andrew and she had a child. She was the first coronation came when she was pregnant, actually. So the popes had to agree to it. And this child, however, lives only 3 years. By the time Giovanna remarries, the child is already very sickly, and he dies. And then she has 2 other children, and they die. And he is running the government very much in a similar way to the way in which the first heiresses, Jeanne of France, had a husband, Philippe, who runs daily government. We have different degrees. The way I say this is that we have enough surviving charters and official royal documents preserved, and you can see whose signature is on them. So it's ordinarily in Navarre and overwhelmingly in Naples, it's the husband. That's what I meant by saying that the pattern, and therefore that emerges in the 14th century, this is the way the joint monarchy system evolves. It already involves one lord murder. And by the way, of course, who is suspected as the mastermind behind the murder? Giovanna. There's a papal investigation to clear her. So this is why, one other reason why there has to be a second joint coronation held subsequently to sort of try to clear the decks, mop up the gore and the bad reputation from the previous experience. He dies, and their children die 1362, and she lives another 20 years. This is when Giovanni Boccaccio describes her government in something called The Lives of Famous Women. Boccaccio's Neapolitan, so it all fits. He should be very, very familiar with Giovanna and her personality and her style of government. She has 2 further marriages, but does not offer coronations to either of these husbands because she is becoming accustomed, apparently, to being fit to rule. So this is a whole bunch of precedents being set here, obviously, for future reference. And yet the whole thing ends with a second murder. And this time the victim is the old woman Giovanna herself, who is still alive, I think, when Boccaccio finishes his manuscript, but is murdered a few years later by the second of her 2 designated successors. She had, because she was childless and the ruling monarch, she named her successor and then changed her mind, and the what we might call the jilted successor attacks her and her court, captures the final husband and captures her and has her quietly strangled. Another opera maybe that's also not written, and so on and so forth. Joanna, by the way, and among my group of 30 female kings in European history, is the only one that has a total of 4 marriages, and we might say 1.5 joint coronations also. But by and large, the women monarchs do not have a great number of marriages, and I think there's only one of my 30. Joanna's the only one with 4. There's one woman who has 3 marriages. This is Queen Mary of Scotland in the 16th century, whose marriages are only in a period of 8 years, but never rules jointly with any husband. She's in the second half post 1550, and she's already demonstrating a lot of interesting features here. The one thing that the 4 marriage woman and the 3 marriage woman share is that they never ruled jointly with later husbands. So this is the only dubious rule I can offer for how female kingship plays out classically in Latin Europe. During the century after Joanna's second husband died, you find further joint coronations scattered all over the map: Sicily, Portugal, Cyprus, a second one in Navarre. 2 places closer to Belgrade here, Poland and Hungary, Krakow and Budapest. You find barely adolescent royal heiresses getting solo coronations because they had trouble, their fiancés had trouble getting there. And so what happens in the cases of Poland and Hungary is that finally the bridegroom shows up after having many adventures, obviously, and gets a separate coronation as soon as possible after he gets married to his fiancée. It's usually within, it's a week in Poland, I think, between the marriage and the coronation of the new husband. So this is a joint coronation delayed by circumstances of travel and whatnot, and the fact that the marriage could not be held and consummated. But when it is finally held and consummated, then you add on the missing husband, and what you have is the same kind of pattern of ordinary government by the husband in the name of his heiress, the wife, in Poland and in Hungary. These cases I really wanted to come to a little bit more was in Navarre, which is the small place, and the first one is the only kingdom in Europe that has as many as 4 joint coronations over not too long a period of time. It's 230 years or so, 1329 and 1555. And in this place, which began the whole process, the system seems to have worked reasonably well, in the sense that the expectation is that they're going to have a child who will obviously inherit without difficulty, and that the husband will do most of the routine business and all of the fighting and most of therefore the serious diplomatic negotiations with neighboring powers. Managing most political business. But one of the problems that people cannot foresee, and that history is maliciously willing to demonstrate to you, is what happens when the husband outlives his wife. And in 3 cases in Navarre, in all 4 cases, they have heirs. They have legal heirs, the husband and wife. But in one of the 4 Navarre cases, is actually the third one, the husband outlives the wife. Usually the one case they die almost simultaneously. In 2 other cases, the wife outlives the husband by roughly a decade, and the son inherits. One time, they have 3 children. The husband outlives the wife by 38 years. And what happens is that none of the 3 children is ever allowed to marry, because as a man who has received a coronation, he can prevent the coronation of any of his own children. He ends up inheriting a different kingdom. but that doesn't affect his policy towards his children. So this is one of those unpredictable cases that could go wrong. There is more, of course, more than one way in which a joint coronation can lead to disaster, fiasco, whatever. And it said some of them ended quickly and or grotesquely. An adolescent royal heiress in Sicily gets kidnapped by representatives of the King of Aragon and held incommunicado for 15 years. So when she's in her mid-30s, she's compelled to marry a prince who is barely half her age. And predictably, they have no children. He outlives her long enough to pass his kingdom on to his brother. So another case where a joint marriage fails for external reasons is in, there's two cases where Portugal in the year 1384 and Cyprus, these are when the joint marriages take place, in Cyprus 1459. In two cases, the heiress is and her husband are overthrown in her kingdom by her illegitimate half-brother. In both cases, the half-brother is notably older than she, but because he's illegitimate, he could not legally marry an heiress. In Portugal, it was simply because the illegitimate brother was Portuguese and the heiress's husband was a foreigner, and that sufficed to have a national rising against the foreign king. In Cyprus, it's much more interesting. The foreign intervention in this case does not come from a Christian power. It comes from the suzerain of Cyprus in the 15th century, who is the Mameluke Sultan of Egypt, and to whom the fugitive older illegitimate half-brother of the newly crowned female monarch flees. Oh, this illegitimate half-brother, by the way, doubles as the Latin Archbishop of Cyprus. So he's the only Latin Archbishop who is ever the guest of honor at a celebration of the Prophet's birthday in Cairo, in Mamluk Egypt, among his other dubious distinctions. And yet he gets the support of the Sultan of Cyprus. His men convince the Janissaries who are running Egypt to support him rather than his kid sister. Because after all, in Islam, monogamy does not exist legally. And so there is no stigma. There is no such thing as an illegitimate prince as long as his father acknowledges him. So in this case, then, a bunch of Janissaries invade Cyprus, overthrow both the wife and the husband, and take the kingdom over and hand it to the ex-archbishop, who is now the king under Egyptian suzerainty. So the ways in which, in other words, the ways in which a joint coronation can crash are difficult to imagine, and it's like the murders in the Italian case. They are very dramatic, and yet, somehow creative literature hasn't had very much to say about these things. The other thing to acknowledge is that the case in Navarre, where the husband outlives the wife by 38 years, is actually matched by those two cases in Poland and Hungary, where the women, one case they die from the complications of childbirth, which is a problem throughout the Ancien regime, because there are problems in childbirth that you can find all over the place in the 18th century, for example, among royalty. But in the other thing to remember is that in the cases of Poland and Hungary, where the husbands got the separate coronations as soon as they married, and then their wives die within a short number of years, the husbands outlive them. And they outlive the wife by 38 years in Hungary and by 42 years in Hungary, 38 years in Poland. By the way, I could say that the wife in Poland is also the only one of my 30 female monarchs who is today an official saint of the Roman Catholic Church because of her efforts in attempting to proselytize among the Slavic Christians of Eastern Europe, actually. The husband is Lithuanian. He's a pagan. He converts to Christianity before he marries his wife and before he gets the coronation. And so this is how Lithuania becomes a Latin Christian state, too, in the 15th century. So there's a lot of things that are going on, a lot of joint marriages sometimes, and there are even joint rule by husband and wife in places that don't have formal coronations. There are two of these examples that happen actually almost simultaneously in the later Middle Ages, in the 1470s. Two major places. One of them is not officially even a monarchy, but I couldn't resist putting it in on the grounds that it was certainly the richest state in Northern Europe, much richer and more prestigious than most kingdoms at the time. These are famous cases, actually. The first one is Castile after 1474. This is the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella. And what you find when you try to politically dissect the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, which is the most famous and I think also importantly the most durable joint marriage in the whole collection. It lasts 30 years. They are married before she acquires a throne. He acquires a throne after she does, but it's a smaller throne in a neighboring kingdom. And they are joint rulers in her kingdom, though not quite in his. But they're joint rulers for 30 years. She dies first in 1504. And when you look at it, you see that she does a fair share of the joint royal business, but she behaves as though her husband, without a formal, because they don't have formal coronations in Castile. It's the biggest European kingdom, most prosperous, most dynamic, best army, but it doesn't have the kind of coronations that the English, as we know, still do. It's just not in their tradition. So the heiress to the throne made very sure that she got a husband who would be up to the job, and he was. That's the other example is maybe less famous, but even more politically consequential. And this is the duchy, the so-called Duchy of Burgundy, the most important non-royal state in the late Middle Ages. And it is composed of a whole collection of dukedoms and counties and so on. Becomes, in the 16th century, the 17 provinces of the Netherlands. This is the core of that polity. And the associated provinces of the Netherlands formally acknowledge new rulers through things called joyous entries, in which the husband and the wife are paraded into town and with the most elaborate ceremonies possible. It's not religious. It's really simply political. So the Archduchess of Austria by marriage, who is the last Duchess of Burgundy, the only female heiress of the group, immediately makes few entries before her marriage, but overwhelmingly most of them afterwards. Her husband fights the war against the French in order to preserve whatever they could of the associated things from her father. And they have 3 children, 2 of whom survive, son and a daughter. This is another case like Poland, Hungary, and the one time in Navarre where the husband ends up outliving his wife by 37 years. Maximilian, the emperor, who becomes a Holy Roman Emperor in the process, and therefore has a son and a daughter, his only legal children he ever had, by his first wife. So I do say, and here again, this is a bow towards the law school. Joint spousal rule seems to have, from the beginning in Naples, or from the beginning in Navarre, rather, to the very end in England, involves a lot of what we now call prenuptial contracts, because a kingdom with an heiress is inviting a foreign prince to take over monarchical responsibilities, or much of them, most of the time. And therefore it requires elaborate who gets the last word on this issue and that issue, things negotiated by teams of legal experts from each side. The most elaborate, the joint rule of Ferdinand and Isabella in Castile has generated an amazing set of documents. These people, both sides, were really good litigators. They had teams of good litigators, and their circumstances changed at different times during their reign. A whole bunch of things required new negotiations, and they got them. Okay, so the other thing to point out about Ferdinand and Isabel is Isabel dies first. Ferdinand, they have 5 children. And oh yes, the children of Burgundy and of Castile intermarry jointly. The daughter in Burgundy marries the crown prince in Castile, and the crown prince to the Burgundian heritage marries one of the 4 sisters of that crown prince. Now, the crown prince in Spain dies before his parents. That was another reason for renegotiating a lot of prenuptial contracts. Let me back up for a second here. The intermarriage, intermarriage on the side of the Burgundian prince did not marry the obvious heiress to the Spanish throne after her brother died. But she becomes the natural heiress due to the death of an older sister before either Ferdinand or Isabel dies. So there is a whole bunch of further negotiations. But what happens is, therefore, this is how the Duke of Burgundy, Philip, the son of Maximilian, marries Juana of Castile, who is infamous in history as Juana la Loca, who is one of those heiresses. In fact, of all the group of 30, she happens to be the heiress who runs as far as and as fast as she can from most formal political responsibilities. Hence, Juana la Loca. She does not want to be royal insofar as it involves a lot of responsibilities. She's pious. She's a great mother, but she's not a political factor. So the other joint spousal reign I wanted to talk about involves somebody who is a great-great-granddaughter of Isabel the Catholic and Mary of Burgundy. We're at the end of the 16th century, after the death of Philip II. And the Burgundian lands have been very difficult to rule from Spain. They're in perpetual rebellion. And so the dying king of Spain decides, he has a son and 2 daughters. and most of Spain itself goes to his son, with possessions in Latin America, for example. But the daughter is to get the Burgundian heritage. Now, by the time Philip dies, his daughter is 32 years old, and she's unmarried. She ends up, the will suggests that she will become the joint ruler of the old Burgundian land. She is an infanta of Spain. She's an archduchess, or she becomes an archduchess. She must marry her first cousin, which is within the prohibited bounds, so there's a lot of negotiations. She must marry her first cousin, who is 29 years old and a cardinal, and actually an inquisitor general in Portugal, among other things. Yes, it's a little rich, but the last will and testament makes them the joint rulers. Now, this implausible circumstance generates the second longest and arguably the second most successful joint rule in European history. It's called the reign of the archdukes in present-day Belgium, but throughout the Low Countries, they were already, the North was in rebellion, and they were never able to stop the rebellion. But they are the good old days of present-day Belgium, is the result of this childless, but 22-year-old lasting joint rule, in which they are really almost fuller partners than Ferdinand and Isabella. In other words, insofar as this clumsy sounding system called joint spousal rule could function in Western history, this is the two great cases come out of actually the Spanish Burgundian nexus. Problem is, of course, that in this case, the husband dies first, and when he dies, she immediately loses all authority in the Low Countries, but her nephew, who is actually the new king in Spain, has at least the minimal good sense to name her the governor general of the region for the rest of her life, which lasts another 13 years. So the other thing here, the final joint commemoration, joint coronation, is still celebrated in my country by something called the College of William and Mary, which is founded during their joint reign in England in 1695. The political arrangement was absolutely standard. The husband didn't realize until he had successfully overthrown his father-in-law that he was not the heir, that it was actually his wife, who was the daughter that had been overthrown. But she was totally uninterested in public affairs. One of those other cases of a woman who did not really want the political responsibilities. And so this will also factor into the second part of the story. And it is getting to be time to break. I did want to say, though, that there's a woman who matters a great deal on the other side of the line. I'm skipping here a couple of pages about some of the other crazy details. There are rich details all over the place. The most successful and most original female monarch in the whole early list is back in the 14th century again, but later than Joanna of Naples, and acquires ambiguously gendered formal titles. This is the only case of someone from Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Margaret of Denmark, younger daughter of a Scandinavian king, widow of another. She becomes the first, and until 1743, the only European woman governing more than one kingdom. She folded her husband's larger but less populous kingdom, Norway, into a subordinate role to her father's kingdom, Denmark. and Norway remains that way for 4 centuries. So no less remarkable that the official language that makes her royal authority indefinite is gendered simultaneously female, male, and neuter. A week after her son's death, Denmark, her father's kingdom, acknowledges her as its almighty lady, husband, and governor. In other words, more specifically, she's something called the sovereign lady for mäktige Frau. I can't really do Swedish very well, Norwegian, Danish very well. For mäktige Frau, husbonde, lord, and guardian, forminder of the, so she's the husband, the guardian, and the sovereign of Denmark simultaneously. And then, surely enough, her husband's kingdom also entitles her mighty lady and husband of Norway for all the days of her life. She adopts a great nephew, renames him, and has him crowned as king in all 3 kingdoms. That solves the succession problem. She doesn't give him anything to do until he's 30 years old. He marries him off to an English king's daughter. By the time she's dead and he has something to do, he outlives her long enough to be deposed in all 3 kingdoms. So I'm about to shift gears. And the women ruling alone are a different category. I attempted to pause for stuff, but I'm running slower than I wanted to. My first European set of female kings ruled jointly for most of all of their reigns. The second half rarely do so. And there is no more case of a joint rule with husband and wife, although the monarchs in Western Europe are married. So what I think I want to do is here to simplify the text I've given you. I do stand by all the stuff in it, by the way. And so you're entitled to raise the question out of the stuff I haven't actually talked about if you read and object to it. So the joint rule basically disappears, and it's replaced by solo female rules. And what I want to do is to argue that the closest thing to a transition, how do you get from the norm of a female heiress being joint spousal rule to one where, no, she rules alone, which is, of course, what has just happened in England after the last 70 years. And there are 2 cases, and only 2 cases in European history, where sisters inherit the same throne. They both happen in the same kingdom, which is England, and across a span of a century and a half. The first case begins in 1553. The second case begins in 1702. So all 4 women inherit as adults. They're at least in their mid-20s. First time, neither sister is married. Second time, both sisters are married, but neither has a surviving child. Each time, strongly negative experience with the disadvantages of joint spousal rule leads the younger sister into unprecedented political arrangements. In the first case, she adamantly resists all requests that she marry and beget an heir. She just stays single. That's the time when the 2 sisters are both single. The second case, when they're both married, she doesn't have that choice. So she gives her husband no political responsibilities. None. The first pair of sisters is Mary and Elizabeth Tudor in 16th century England. Mary, who follows her half-brother on the throne in 1553 after a rebellion against somebody called the 9 Days Queen. Mary gets married within a year to the Crown Prince of Spain, who is himself the Crown Prince of Spain is a widower with a 6-year-old son. But that son has no rights in England, prenuptial arrangements, and the marriage is therefore solemnized, but does not automatically involve a coronation for the husband. The English balked at this. Nonetheless, the reign is known, and you'll find it on their coins. Philip and legal law, the laws of the land. There's a lot of Protestants being burned at this time in England. Are Philip and Mary 1 through 4. The coinage of the realm is in the names of Philip and Mary, but he's never officially crowned. She dies. They have no children. He loses all authority over his wife's kingdom. And Elizabeth then takes over, and based on this experience, but in which time she's mostly been in effect under house arrest for religious reasons, never risks marriage, lives 45 years, longest reign in European history until the 19th century. And it's a real reign. I mean, she is the sole authority, monarchical authority of the kingdom. So that's, and on top of that, Elizabeth is also the person who promotes and sponsors the doctrine of the king's two bodies, which gets me into the meta-person notion that you brought up yesterday. And that happens in the year 1562, which is 4 years after her coronation. But when England is getting used to the idea of an unmarried female sovereign for the first time. So I'm getting on there. I really had a whole bunch of things I wanted to say. There's a lot about Maria Theresa and Catherine II of Russia. As the 18th century goes on, as I said, the pattern is that a lot of the women rulers in Western Europe are married. Some of them have successor children, some don't. But the husband never has major authority in his wife's kingdom. Maria Theresa of Austria is the outstanding example here. Successful marriage, 16 children. But her husband is finally given a coronation. She has two separate coronations in Bohemia and in Hungary. She had to do a lot of spectacular stuff in Hungary, particularly, including negotiating in Latin and riding a charger up a hill with waving a sword at the enemies of the kingdom. And this is shortly after giving birth, which is, I will admit, is a combination that I find very hard to understand. I mean, okay, it happened, but it's a rare mix of talent for somebody who didn't have any official training in politics. Catherine II of Russia, of course, is much more interesting because she might even count as a self-made widow and managed a coup d'etat in which she overthrew her husband. So, and then goes on. Now, these women also have the longest rules in European history, next to Elizabeth I of England. Maria Theresa is the ruler of Bohemia, of Hungary for 39 years and Bohemia for 37. Catherine II of Russia, who was a decade older than Maria Theresa when she staged her coup d'etat, Catherine II has, well, these women are not their commemorations are peculiar by contemporary existence. To me, that what I mean is that when I look at scholarship, at stuff, how they are acknowledged and remembered today, it's pretty interesting, but I don't know to what extent you might really call this enlightening. I'm going to skip all the way through here towards the end. Yes, near the end. Okay. The fact that there are, if you say, what about books, and there's a lot of commemorations. There's Catherine of Russia has had a really terrific female biographer. Maria Theresa has had a couple of weighty tomes. Maria Theresa gets commemorated by multi-volume works on the 100th printed works on the 100th and the centennials of her birth, which was in 1717. So there's a 10-volume biography of Maria Theresa. She's the only European female ruler with that dubious distinction, and a gigantic statue. I suppose most of you have been in Vienna sometime. There's a magnificent statue of her, planned by the same man who did the 10-volume biography, which you still see as you go around the ring, headed toward the Hofburg. So Catherine the Great has had a bunch of biographies, no great ones yet by a Russian. The most outstanding ones tend to be in Western European languages. But then she is a German by birth, and there's a bunch of reasons here maybe. So one of the things, if you do want to do a really ridiculous kind of comparison, I was going to say both Catherine II of Russia and Maria Theresa have been commemorated recently by multi-part TV specials on and the Russian version for Catherine the Great is done shortly after Putin decided to make a move in Ukraine. There is an award-winning television series about her rise to power and reign for the Russian Channel 1, which was first shown in 2015 and had a second season in 2017, a third in 2019. Maria Theresa, well, she gets a 4-part miniseries from 2017 to 2019, and there's apparently a sequel coming out. But it is a Czech, Austrian, Slovakian, Hungarian co-production covering the early years of her reign. So, and there's some, I think, feminist hesitancy among some of my friends and colleagues in the States about these women, because I think it has to do with the fact that Maria Theresa has all those children. There's 16 of them. This is, you look at the rest of the whole series, second place is 5. That's Isabel the Catholic of Spain. It's just beyond experience of anybody you are likely to be familiar with in your own lifetime. Similarly, maybe with Catherine, there's only 3 children, and they're all born during her marriage, but they have 3 different fathers, which is also something that female politicians in the 21st century do not want to have on their CVs. I think it's fair enough to say. So there you are. Female rule in Europe as attempted to be reimagined a little bit by the man who in his retirement was given a grant that is restricted to emeritus professors in order to investigate a subject on which he has, by definition, no previous experience. And it has been a magnificent journey, let me say. Thank you very much for making this a part of it. I'm willing to field some questions because it is already 10:37. Is that right? So.
Thank you very much, Professor. This was a very interesting lecture. I hope we can squeeze in a few questions before the break. So are there any questions? Yes?
Thank you. And I would like to ask you regarding the first part of the women that were excluded from ruling on their own. Can we find in any text any justification why women are not fit to rule? And I'm asking that because, for example, in Roman law, where women are considered to be permanently minors who need to have a tutor, the original justification brought by the Roman jurists was that this was due to the infirmitas sexus and levitas animi, the weak sex and the mind that is not mature enough, which Gaius, the jurist, finds that is not a proper justification because they can run their business on their own. I was wondering if you have any example of similar justification for them not being fit to rule.
I didn't do too hard a search for details, but bear in mind that every legal advisor to a monarchy in Europe throughout this period has some familiarity with Roman law. In fact, it becomes increasingly important as the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries roll along in terms of normative rules of procedure in all sorts of courts and governments. Roman law is the giant or the elephant in the room. You don't need to redo this. All these lawyers, all the jurists advising coronations and so on are fully aware of this. And so, the problem is that therefore, if you're going to have an amendment to it that says, under certain conditions, fault of male heirs, for example, but in hereditary monarchies, we're willing to have coronations for women. And I don't find too many elaborate legal briefs. All I find, for example, in Navarre, is simply some traces of the negotiations. What does the husband have to give up in order to get himself in the same coronation ceremony as his wife? There's probably more of them from Naples, and there would be, because that's a papal fief. But canon law is so close to Roman law on this matter. Certainly the popes didn't want to recognize the woman in Navarre. They were actually living in Avignon, and Salic law comes out of Roman law very strongly in this way. And Salic law is the other, in my perspective, is the elephant in the room here too. Because everybody knows about the French. They're one of the prestigious kingdoms they're not the empire, but they're the next in prestige, antiquity, venerability, whatever. And so I can't have a woman ruler in France, but I can have one in Navarre, which used to be part of France. I can have one in England, which fought the 100 Years' War because they thought the French got it wrong in 1328. I mean, in fact, when I was writing the book, I had to kind of figure out for myself the idea that female inheritance was possible, and in order to actually make it work in practice, you needed the sacrament of marriage. You needed the absence of plausible male heirs in order to accept the idea that a woman is as ruler is always, there's always a priority of men, but the woman has to be a closer heir. And this is it's a problem that precedes 1328. It just doesn't seem to ever lead to any kind of coronation in European history until that point. Male coronations go way, 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 way back. So That's as close as I can come. But no, there are actually flip it around a little bit and say there are there is no elaborate legal justification for a woman to be fit to rule against Roman law. It happens. We have a lot of records that show it happened, but not legal justifications. I was looking for them. I couldn't find them. There's a few vernacular texts in the 16th century that suggest female inheritance is, after all, allowed by all sorts of customs and laws in different places and times. But that doesn't, the idea of working it up into a full formal legal argument for female right to govern, I'm simply not aware of it.
Gotcha. But we won't be able to see you. Maybe you could move towards the camera. The people online won't see you.
Okay.
They want to see, okay, so the camera is disturbingly close. I'm sorry for all the people online having to see me from this perspective. First of all, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture, Professor Monter. And I would have two questions. The first would consider the strings of female queens or female rulers. As you mentioned, if you discount the Netherlands in the late modern and early contemporary era, the best example we have is England in the Tudor era with three monarchs, Lady Jane Grey, then Mary Tudor and Elizabeth. Why do you think that even female rulers considered other females unfit to rule and choose mostly male candidates to succeed him, which we have the case with Queen Elizabeth I? And the second question would consider the Russian string of female monarchs. So even though it was shortly interrupted by several male candidates, in the 70 years between 1725 and 1796, you had 4 female monarchs and 3 male, the males ruling for about 4 years and the females ruling for the rest of the time. And to that extent, why do you believe that the rules of succession were tweaked in order to skip over Elizabeth or Elizabeth Petrovna instead of her also female cousin? You talked about it in your paper.
I'll flip do the answers in reverse. The Russian example is all the responsibility, put all the blame, if you want to, on Peter the Great, Peter the First, who late in his life, who after all was one of the very few male monarchs who deliberately has his son and heir killed. And at the end of his reign, decides, therefore, that he will name his successor, and it turns out to be his widow, who is the only illiterate woman of my 30. And Peter simply says the only rule of succession is that every tsar, tsarina, names a successor. Well, the women all name male successors, actually, every one of them, including Catherine. And so it's that in other words, Roman law, whatever, all this other stuff that I've just been talking about is suspended. The English thing is simply that there was an enormous shortage of plausible male candidates, largely because there's this king named Henry VIII, who is the father of both of these sisters and of a son who actually inherits first from him. And Henry is notorious for 6 wives, at least 2 of whom he had executed, which is another one of those dubious distinctions, and a ton of men. Henry just chopped heads off all over the place for all sorts of reasons. He got people who were too close to Martin Luther and too far against him, and he cut all their heads off. No, there are individual rulers, in other words, who are partly behind all this. But we're in a school of law, and And it's something like the absence of texts. Yes, you go all the way back to Roman law. It is so fundamental to this process, as far as I can understand it.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Yes.
Yes. So my thanks as well for this extremely informative and wide-ranging presentation. I had a question about childlessness, because you touched upon that several times in your presentation, and also from the sort of historian's perspective, for like an average woman, let's say medieval Europe, their agency was much stronger usually if it's a widow with no children. In the Byzantine case, there are a lot of examples of that.
Yeah.
What role does childlessness play in your cases? This Giovanna example is interesting in that respect. Is a female ruler more empowered if she doesn't have children, living children, or not? Probably different in different contexts.
Yeah. Well, if she was the first case of her type, Giovanna, therefore, it's hard to say. Everybody was trying to make up the rules as they go along. But Giovanna had 3 term pregnancies by 2 men. The first one being the prince who got killed, and she was considered the likeliest. The cui bono argument fits that. So and then she has changes her mind about who her heir is going to be. No, I think in this term, the problem is that a woman ruler is already exceptional, and that that actually one imagines that the travels and the strains and whatnot of the responsibilities of monarchy don't rarely contribute. One imagines to having a large number of healthy children. Credit to Isabel the Catholic for having managed as well as she did with hers. So I don't know. There are tons of unknowables. The trick is to find some knowables, and then the problem of Giovanna, not, as I said, these things are. God, this is Naples. This is tailor-made for operatic themes, for example. Where are they? Where's the works of art? Where's the creative literature coming out of this? And even then take the other end and say, what about Catherine the Great and Maria Theresa and the television programs in the 21st century? Well, Maria Theresa is the godmother of the European Union, for goodness sakes. And Catherine is I think is the kind of elephant in the room for Russians. A bunch of reasons, including she's a convert to Orthodoxy and so on. So the commemoration of these people, or their non-commemoration. Elizabeth I of England, yes, she is the darling of feminist scholarship in my country to this day. I hope that's. You want to try another follow-up?
No. Just a very quick comment. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there's another. I think it's Hulu TV series about Catherine the Great. I think it's called The Great. And yes, I would describe it as sort of more of a feminist, even comic take, I guess, on.
Yes, there are life. Yes. And tons about Elizabeth, of course, but Catherine can be commemorated in that way outside Russia. But she is, after all, a seminal figure in Russian history too, and that's why I was really looking and commenting there that the official TV shows about these women are almost comically different in terms of the audience, the purpose, and so on today. I thank you guys for attending. I am. It's a privilege at my age to be given a microphone and too much room and time.
We have one more short question.
Yes.
If I may, because it is not directly related to your lecture, but it's about Kantorowicz. It's about Ernest Kantorowicz. Kantorowicz.
The King's
The Things Two Bodies.
Ah, yes, yes.
What, have you? Were you his student
No.
at Princeton? Or do you have any memories about him?
No, you have the wrong member of the Northwestern History Department. My good colleague and fellow emeritus medievalist Robert Lerner written a very good biography of Kantorowicz, to which I can refer you. It's a really fine work because Kantorowicz had at least a couple of different historical specialties, including a great study of Frederick II, the emperor. So Lerner knows everything about Kantorowicz. I know nothing except what I read from my colleague, but I'll ask him.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Are we ready for a break?
Let's make a break, a 10-minute coffee break, and after that we continue with the session on women in power. Thank you once again, Professor.